Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Chris Bruntlett, and I am the Marketing and Communication Manager at the Dutch Cycling Embassy, as Bas kindly introduced me. And I'm going to be providing you a bit of an outsider's international perspective on what is happening around cycling and the corona crisis around the world. So first, a quick introduction to the Dutch Cycling Embassy. We're started in 2011, for those of you who aren't familiar, and we're a public-private partnership between about 75 organizations that are operating in the field of cycling. They're working in cities and countries around the world, helping to export all of this knowledge and expertise that exists here in the Netherlands. And so we have the exciting job of packaging everything that the Netherlands has learned over the last 5 decades and helping cities get started on their own journey towards becoming cycling places. But first, I want to preface this presentation with a few words on the word opportunity, because I myself am hesitant to use the word opportunity. I think we have to begin by acknowledging what a terrible thing Corona was for our cities and for our society, not just the loss of life, but the loss of people's livelihoods in terms of their business. Our economy is going to take years to recover, and also our transportation system, specifically the public transportation network, which has suffered tremendous losses in terms of its capacity and its attractiveness. So we will hesitantly use the word opportunity moving forward, but we need to acknowledge that this is quite a terrible situation that we're operating in. And yeah, so I'm going to break my presentation into 3 phases, I guess, throughout the Corona crisis. The changes that were made to the streets were in response to 3 specific stages of the crisis. The first being the lockdown in March, when cities were starting to advise or require their residents to stay home, stay indoors for long periods of time. And I think they also recognized that there was a necessity to help people get outside to exercise not just their physical health, but their mental health, access nature, do physically distant social activity with their neighbors. And so there were a lot of cities, mostly in North America, that created these really quick and easy networks of slow streets, just putting in barriers of signage, trying to reduce the speeds to 30 kilometers an hour and limiting it only to local traffic to give a lot of the space to people not just on bicycle but on foot, jogging, skateboarding, and allowing children to play in the streets. And for the most part, they were largely successful and popular amongst the residents, who could suddenly experience the street outside their house in a very different way for the first time. And then, as cities started coming out of lockdown, there was a very real problem, a problem of geometry that was becoming apparently clear. We use London as an example because they have some really staggering numbers in terms of the impact that the physical distancing measures had on their public transport network. Because it could only operate at around 1/5 the capacity, we were talking about 8 million journeys within the City of London that had to be absorbed by other modes of transportation. And as you can see on the screen here, that is equal to a 10-fold increase in cycling or a 5-fold increase in walking. And the city suddenly realized that if just a fraction of those people hopped in their cars for those 8 million journeys, then suddenly the city would be in big trouble in terms of collapsing under the weight of all those extra cars, creating extra congestion, pollution, and traffic collisions. And so they set about trying to provide alternatives for those journeys. That was quantified in a study that Amsterdam-based Decisio did for the Italian government, trying to quantify what the cost of inaction was versus the cost of creating space for walking and cycling. And they came up with some quite staggering numbers that simply allowing for the rising car use that the drop in public transportation would require would cost their society upwards of 20 billion euros each and every year. And simply by carving out a little bit of extra space for walking and cycling, allowing some of those shorter trips to be made on foot and bicycle, they could potentially save their society upwards of 20 billion euros per year. And so that led to a lot of Italian cities carving their streets, and Milan is probably the most prominent example in terms of creating subsidies for bikes and electric bikes, new cycle routes, and widening the footpaths and reducing the speed limits. So as cities started coming out of lockdown, we saw suddenly a lot of them were building up these pop-up networks of cycling infrastructure, just using paint and some planter boxes or traffic cones or flex posts. The European Cyclist Federation has quantified this, and they've created a dashboard where almost 2,300 kilometers of cycling infrastructure has been built in the past 6 months, and that's almost €1 billion put towards pro-cycling measures. And it's not just Europe, it's obviously happening in North America, in Australia, in Africa. There are plenty of examples of cities that are using this opportunity, again, I use that word hesitantly, to create more space for cycling on their streets. But if you are watching what's happening in the Netherlands, you may be surprised to see that very little has actually been changed in terms of the street. And I think a lot of people may view that as a negative thing, but I want to suggest that perhaps it's a positive thing insofar as the country already has this massive network of cycling infrastructure, almost 37,000 kilometers of segregated lanes, 80% of the urban streets being local access streets, which are limited access to cars with a 30-kilometer-hour speed limit or less. And so as a result, people were able to get from A to B, and the transport network was able to absorb those lost trips that may have been taken by bus, tram, or train simply by the way that the streets were designed and the space that had already been taken from the automobile. That obviously hasn't always been that way, and I think there are a lot of parallels to what's happening now to the crises that occurred here in the Netherlands in the 1970s. In 1972, there was a culmination of a really terrible road safety crisis, as many of you probably know, that was killing vast numbers of people, and specifically children, on the streets, that created this huge social movement, and that, in combination with the OPEC oil crisis in 1973, really created this turning point for the Netherlands as a country to understand that their cities could no longer be built for and by the car. They had to start building other modes of transportation into their mobility networks. And so the Netherlands set about this journey for 20 years to just kind of try things. And I think a lot of good things came out of that process, and there were mistakes made along the way. You look at cities like Tilburg and The Hague that tried these demonstration routes that did not necessarily work. But through that trial and error process, some really important principles emerged: the hierarchy of streets, the requirement of separation for distributor roads, the severe traffic calming that takes place on slower streets, and then the idea of designing an entire network of cycling, and not just individual cycling routes, but using these 5 design principles that came out of, again, this experimentation phase, the most notable of which happened in Delft in terms of planning a cycling network. So as we look forward to what the Netherlands can teach the world, I think one area where we can really use our expertise and our strengths is in terms of using cycling to support the public transportation networks. As we said, the attractiveness to public transport is going to last years, if not decades, with people scared to take the bus, tram, or train. And cycling can be used, as it's often done here in the Netherlands, to feed additional customers into the system, provided that there's secure parking provided and a last mile solution at the other end in terms of the OV-fiets system. So as we look forward to the third phase, which hopefully as a vaccine arrives and we start rebuilding our cities and our economy and our mobility network, I think cycling can play a huge role in that green recovery, especially as we look forward to the next crisis insofar as the climate crisis. I think cities are understanding that transportation is one area where they can get a relatively quick and easy return on investment by creating modal shift away from cars and towards walking, cycling, and public transportation. And so one of the great examples is happening right now in Sydney, in that they are trying to accelerate their 36-year, 5,000-kilometer cycling plan to push it to just 3 years, and they're eyeing that as an opportunity to build back better, if you will, and build back in a more sustainable way. So the last thought I want to leave you with is around resilience, and I think resilience is a a topic that's come up a lot lately, but we tend to focus on the engineering definition of resilience, which is the return of a system back to its original state, its ability to bounce back to its pre-existing condition. And in so far as that traditional definition goes, there's an alternate definition of ecological resilience, which I think is really interesting and may have been an example of what happened here in the Netherlands. Is the system itself did not bounce back to its original form. It didn't bounce back to normal, so to speak, but it actually created a new normal, and that is a different form of resilience that perhaps our cities could look at as an example. These two photographs are quite strikingly similar, one Amsterdam in 1973 and the other in Milan in present day. So I hope that that was a relatively quick and inspiring look at what's happening around the world, and how the Netherlands can potentially lead the way in terms of helping other cities become more bicycle friendly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It's really impressive what's happening, and I feel like it was already happening for a little bit. What really changed is the COVID crisis, but all these kind of ideas were already there, isn't it?
Exactly, and I think a lot of the cities that I mentioned, like London, Milan, Paris, they had these cycling plans that were 20-year horizon, 30-year horizon, that were on the shelf, and they were kind of chipping away at them one piece by piece. And what COVID has done is just forced them to do it all at once. And it's time will tell whether they're able to make that temporary infrastructure permanent, which is going to be the challenge as more and more cars come onto the streets. The case has to be made to the population that these cycling networks are actually reducing the number of cars in the city ultimately.
And is there a feeling like it's all about cycling, or do you feel it's also about walking or having more green in the, because cities tend to be really concrete areas, isn't it?
Yeah. It's all of the above. It really is. I mean, we certainly don't. Reducing space for automobiles has all these additional benefits, right? Of course, and you're creating space for playing, for planting of greenery, for people on foot who no longer have to cross 4 lanes of traffic to get along across the street. So there are all these added benefits just by creating cycling infrastructure that benefit thousands of other people, whether they ride a bicycle or not.